You're listening to Left Up the Valley 2.0, Atheist, Skeptic, and Humanist Radio.
All right, our next guests are Tracie and Jen. They are smart, they are funny, they are hilarious, and they are brilliant. Perfect. Ladies, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering for a minute if you were actually talking about us.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't recognize these people you're describing.
I love it. Oh, perfect. Oh, Tracie, you've been on the show before, and Jen, this is your first time on the show, so congratulations.
Indeed.
Hopefully, I'll scare you away. Tracie, by the way, I gotta really thank you. I never had a chance to actually thank you for being on the show we had, the last show we did with Nancy. You were gracious enough to come on the show, and I never got a chance to thank you about that. It really meant a lot to me. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.
Hey, you're very welcome. I mean, I didn't have a lot to say, but a lot. I listened and I learned a lot, and so it was nice to hear.
But you know what? Your presence meant a lot to Nancy.
Oh.
Nancy, we're really, really glad you were there because she was a great admirer of yours and your work. So it meant a lot, and of course, it meant a lot to her. It means it meant a lot to me. Anyway, let's not go back into all that.
Well, you're welcome.
Ladies, maybe if you'd be so kind, you give our audience a quick bio as to who Jen and Tracie are.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go first. So I'm Tracie Harris. I kind of rose to, I guess, public recognition working on the Atheist Experience. I'm no longer on the Atheist Experience, but I've since gone on to do like my own stuff. I have a podcast now called At Home in My Head that is more of a social justice oriented program. Also in the past did Godless Bitches, which was a really, I think, good effort. And that's mainly how folks, I think, would probably know who I am. I don't do much beyond that. I mostly just do a lot of activism online, and that's sort of my sideline.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Jen Peeples, also formerly of the Atheist Experience and Godless Bitches. And of the two, I consider Godless Bitches to be probably the best work I've ever done in online, production there. And I'm not involved with any regular podcast or any online presence right now, other than my own personal Facebook and Twitter feed. And I consider myself an LGBTQ activist because I am part of that community. And mostly I'm just really busy doing my engineering job and being a mom of a very active teenager and holding down family and work. So that's who I am.
And I gotta say, first of all, the title "Godless Bitches." Come on, that's just an awesome title. You guys are like rooting it for anybody else that even tries to get close to that now, right? I mean, come on. We should almost do a revival of that "Godless Bitches 2.0" or something.
Well, I mean, there has been a revival of it. I don't know what the status is. It didn't involve us, but I know they did relaunch some stuff. I think ours was the 2.0, and then there's since been like a 3.0 with other people.
Yeah.
I think so.
Never trust these shows that say 2.0, by the way. They're just like horrible.
Hey, I do want to just note that Jen is a sometimes guest on my podcast. So if folks are looking to hear, a little bit of Jen, also Phil Session sometimes comes on and has a conversation with me. So those voices are still sporadically available.
We can never get enough of Jen, that's for sure. But let's talk about your show, At Home in My Head, which is an interesting title. What was the genesis of that, Tracie?
Actually, the reason that I started it had nothing to do with what I'm doing right now with it. So when I entered my activism in the atheist community, I had completed a project that was very important to me personally. I had been trying to find information on indoctrination, and I had a lot of difficulty finding that. And every several years or so, I would take a deep dive into trying to find if somebody had actually done any research into indoctrination and how it works and what it does to your head. Every time I would go to a conference, I would end up in a corner talking to people who had been in extremely conservative, like ultra conservative Christian groups. And we almost had a unique experience that we could relate to that other people couldn't, which is why we would end up talking to each other. So people would be talking about how they were in these really abusive marriages because the religions that they were part of had, prescriptions about getting married and staying married no matter what, and how the men were the head of the household. And so there were super abusive, super patriarchal systems. And you also had all kinds of other things where people were believing, literalist interpretations like the Noah's flood. This was like the really hardcore religious belief. And so you would go to these conferences, and people who've never been really had their heads deep into that just don't really relate to it. And it's a difficult thing to describe. And I've had people say, well, we've all been wrong about things before. And I'm like, this is not just being wrong about something. Like, I've been wrong about things before, and this is not that. This is way beyond that. So I finally, after like 20 years of searching, found some information. I came across an article about a guy who was doing psychotherapy, and he was heading up, so he was managing a group of psychotherapists as like a trainer. So it was his job to sort of train these junior therapists. And one of them had a patient who he was saying, he was writing about it. He was like, it almost seems like this guy believes that he needs his religion to sort of absolve him of his sins. But then it's like he just can't get out of the sinfulness. And so then he keeps going back to the religion. So it's not really fixing him. It's like sticking him in this cycle, this problematic cycle that I think is actually making his condition worse. And I wrote to the guy, and I was just like, I just read your article, and I'm trying to find information on indoctrination. And I saw this thing about your patient. Anyway, long story short, he gave me all these links and information. And when I started to look through it, it didn't seem like what I wanted. So I reached out to a friend of mine that I've interviewed before on my podcast and also on my work over at Atheist Experience, Rob Poole, who's like a very prominent psychiatrist in the UK. And he gave me some information as well and said, here's what you're probably looking for. It's going to have to do with authoritarianism, blah, 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 here. So I go and I look at it, and it's like the same type of information the other guy gave me. So at that point, I thought, what don't I understand that they're trying to tell me? Because two people now have heard this thing that I'm saying I'm looking for and given me the same type of information, and I don't see the connection. So I just started going through the materials and like listening to the interviews again and again and reading the articles again and again until finally a light bulb started to come on. And I started to see what they were talking about. Then I started diving into like identity psychology and models of identity psychology. I got into really deep dive stuff, and all these light bulbs were coming on. And I was just like, holy crap, like this is exactly what I've been looking for. I put together a big long talk that was very cumbersome. And the first time I gave it, I just felt like it was not easy to give, right? It was like long, it was hard to hold the people's attention. It was very like way too academic to be a talk that would be saleable. And the thing would go for like an hour and a half or 2 hours. So then I had to give it again, right? And like I say, this was towards the end of my activism. I had pretty much quit being an activist, but I was still getting people that were inviting me to talk. And I felt like it was good information that I'd compiled. I wanted to talk about it, but I was like, it's just not working. And when I sent the what do you call it? The slideshow to one of the psychiatrists to look at, he was like, yeah, I understand. You understand the concepts. Like you've got it right as far as like the models and things, you do understand them. But he's just like, man, this is so dense. Like your slides are way too dense. Like you really need to cut this down somehow. And weirdly, I just started like editing it and editing it and editing it. I got it down to like a half-hour talk, this 2-hour thing that I couldn't edit down. I finally got it down to like half an hour. I got up and gave the talk. And what was really bizarre is that after the talk, when I gave it, I get this line of people that want to come up and talk to me about it, which is normal when you give a talk. People come up and they want to talk to you about your talk. Everybody, half the people in line wanted to talk to me about this bizarre sideline that I had mentioned, that I had come across, right? That had to do with people who have difficulty processing emotion. It's something called alexithymia. And one guy was like, wow, he goes, my whole life I've thought, am I just a psychopath? And he goes, when I heard you talking about this, he's like, that makes so much sense to me. Other people came up and they were just like, I've been indoctrinated. I understood everything you were saying. It resonated so much. And what do I do now? People were breaking down in tears. I mean, it was really amazing to me that it really hit home, not just for me, but other people that had gone through that experience felt it the same way I did. And so it was killing me to think that just at the end of my activism, I had finally come out with like something that I was just like, this is what I've been looking for the last 20 years. I finally find it. And now I'm walking away from my platform. So what do I do with this? And it was killing me. So I was like, I need to get this, at least make it public, even if that's the only thing I do. So I made it public in podcast form. I like read it. I put the slides up. I made a YouTube channel and put it there. So it's out on podcast. It's out on the YouTube channel. I put it on a blog with a TOC that links, so that you can link back and forth with it. And I kind of sat there and was like, okay, great, that's done. And then I thought, well, shit, now I've gone through all the trouble to set up a podcast, set up a YouTube channel, set up a connected blog, like all this stuff that I spent months learning and doing. And now I have this. Do I just walk away from this? Like, do I just say, there it is, leave it? Or is there something useful I can do with it? Right? Is there something I can do? And so I had noticed that a lot of the voices that get platformed are very, what I would call dominant culture voices, right? You hear the same, it's like the same demographic has the microphone over and over and over. And it's the same messages over and over and over. And I had spent so much time in other communities, like the trans community and Black forums and all these different forums where you don't ever hear these voices, and where the messages that I had encountered, I would listen to them and think, wow, that's the weirdest thing I've ever, like, I've never heard that before. What are they even talking about? And then I'd go look at it and I'd start really reading the threads and seeing what people were saying. And I'd be like, holy crap, I've never even been aware of this before until I saw these people talking about it. I've gone my whole life and it's been in my face and I haven't even seen it. Like, how have I not seen this? And I had that experience like again and again and again. One of my friends is like a homeless advocate, right? And she herself is like a single mom and homeless. She struggles with homelessness, like on and off. And so she would talk about like her experiences, and I would just be like, crap, I never would have known this. Like, I never would have guessed this. I didn't see how this was so problematic, like, this particular thing and how it affects people and how it affects the homeless, and, how it doesn't help, or it looks like it's helpful, but it really isn't, And just hearing these people who were literally living their lives in these contexts that are not dominant culture, and how insulated I've been by being, so much of that, right? Like, so yes, I have I'm a woman as part of my identity, and that, does come with like consequences as well. But I also have, like, I'm white, and, like, I heard a comedian recently say something about it's great to be white, right? Because you just get all these advantages, and it's just, I mean, you don't have to worry about your race ever, because that's never a problem for you. But when you hear from people, it's easy to just say, like, to say those words, but to actually get into a forum with people that aren't white and hear them talk about what really their lives are like not being white, and what it means to be non-white, and what kind of experiences they have as a result of not being white, and the types of things they have to sit and wonder about. Is this person being racist, or are they not? Because you end up so used to being treated in a racist way that you don't know if a person's being racist or not. So you're constantly walking around second guessing, which is a crappy way to have to live.
Yeah.
And people a lot of times will be like, well, I just said blah, 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 and I wasn't being racist. I'm not a racist. And you're like, you understand that this person has to walk around thinking all the time, like, is this person being racist or not? They don't know who they're dealing with. They don't know you. They don't know what you mean by that.
Right. And there's so much gaslighting involved too.
Yes.
There's gaslighting constant.
Yeah. Like, whoever says, oh yes, I am a racist and I meant that to be racist. Like, unless you're like a member of the KKK, I don't even know who says that. Right. So, I mean, even when you say something racist, you don't think it's racist. Nobody goes around normally saying things because they think they're racist and they want to be racist. You say racist things and you don't know it. So it was kind of like this enlightening experience for me. And so I started doing these little experiments on social media, and I would share little bits and pieces. And I'd be like, I would take a kind of provocative thing that I had learned and just make a little post about it, see what would happen. And like a few people would get it, and then some people wouldn't get it. And then something would happen, and there'd be like this activity. And soon it would start getting fleshed out. And then people started learning things in my spaces in the same way that I was learning things in these other spaces. And I realized I can use my spaces to teach people by giving these non-dominant voices, by giving these suppressed voices more of a platform. So I thought, hey, here's the solution to what do I do with my podcast. I need to get these voices out. And I don't speak for these people. My goal is to get them on and let them speak for themselves. And so what I do is I just take people that I find that I think are interesting. They aren't people that you've probably ever heard of. Some of them are like artists in their community, because I believe that we should support like Black artists. We should support, communities that don't ever get that kind of publicity that we, see all the time, like take for granted, because you just see white people get lots of opportunity and they have lots of voices and lots of platforms. So I did that. I started doing a whole series, like I called it the Existing series, because a lot of times trans people will describe what they're confronted with as people challenging that they even exist. And so I was like, let me do this series. It's called the Existing series. And so it's just a name, Existing. So Jonathan Existing or Natalie Existing. And it's just them telling their stories. And I bring the people on and I tell them, well, you make your agenda. You tell me what we're talking about. You tell me what's important. Like what to you it would, if you have a microphone for an hour or 2 hours and you could tell the world something that you think they need to know that they don't hear because all they ever hear is the dominant message, what would you want them to know about your experience? And then they set the agenda, we talk about it. When we finally get it settled, we do the recording. Then I edit down the recording. I let them hear it. Nothing releases until they tell me it's okay. And then I put it out, and that's like their story. And that's what I've decided to do with the podcast. Is like, it's not the only thing I'm doing, but to me, it's like the most rewarding thing and the most important thing that I'm doing with those platforms.
So essentially, your podcast could also be called "Walking Them Out in Their Shoes."
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
No,
Well, the thing is, so you were talking about like those things that we don't see being from dominant cultures. So like my more recent one was the whole digital blackface thing.
Oh yeah.
Where people use like GIFs and stuff with like representing Black people, and it's not cool. Like people are very upset about this, like especially on things like social media.
Explain that to me, because this is news to me. I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe
so like if you're on, say, Facebook, right, and you're posting a GIF to make a funny point, right, and you're using a Black person, that's digital blackface. Like you're not Black, you're representing yourself as Black by doing so.
It's kind of an appropriation sort of offshoot, right? So the idea is that, and people don't really understand appropriation. They get so sidetracked, right? They're just like, well, I can't cook Italian food because that's appropriation because I'm right. It's like, no, this is not. Nobody is saying that at all. And in fact, I've been in forums where people are like, well, we did a whole thing on blues recently on my wall, right? The blues, and I have musicians on my wall, white and Black musicians. And so there was some conversation, and there was like a woman who is like classically trained, and she was just like, well, can a Black person play classical music? And I was like, whoa, let's back it up here a minute, because we're talking about a power imbalance here, right? So as far as I know, Black people have not like taken over, and they're not like owning classical music and then stealing it and making sure that they're all getting paid for it, and the people who have written it aren't because they're white. It's like that's not happening. So it's about the idea of giving credit. It's about the idea of not making this other community that has been marginalized and oppressed feel like we are just taking on one more thing that's theirs, right? It's like we already take enough that's theirs. I mean, I'm in the US, and in the US, our entire nation was basically built on stolen labor, on stolen land. I mean, we've taken everything, including their history, their culture. Like when it comes to, I had a conversation with someone recently about the idea of Black and white, and I was explaining these are hierarchical structures. These are social structures. These are not like physical realities. And the reason that we needed to have the label Black was to tell us who it was legal to enslave. Because when you go to Africa, you have people from different nations, right? So when you come to the US and somebody says, well, there is a Black culture, because when it comes to Black, we took people here, we dragged them here as slaves, and we purposely stripped their history, their culture, their ancestry. We broke their families apart. I mean, we made it impossible for them to trace their history back more than like a generation or two. So most people who are Black here have no idea what their ancestry is. If they're Ados, right? So if they're like African descendants of slaves, they really don't know that much history. If they go on to like an ancestry site, right, they can only trace back a little ways. Where somebody like me, I could go back clear to like an immigration status, right? And I know that I have an Italian ancestry, and so I'm not quote white. I mean, yes, I'm white, but my culture and my history comes from Italy. My culture and my history comes from the Midwest, and my father's family back, great 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 grandfather. I can go find photos of these people, but when you're Black, that's been taken from you. Like all you have is your Black American status. That's it. That's all you've got.
Well,
So,
and there were points in this country where being Italian wasn't even considered being white.
Yeah, I mean, you do have different things like that. I mean, I would never ever compare it, right? I would never ever compare it to like what has been dealt with the Black community. But yes, that's a great example of how fluid race is, right? Like you can just sort of throw people in and out of it, and you get to be white, you don't get to be white. There's a case in the 1920s that went through our courts where a guy from India tried to become a naturalized citizen, and he tried to claim that he had Aryan ancestry as somebody from India. And the courts were like, no, that's not white enough. So no, you can't be a citizen. And I don't know that people in the US understand that white really had like a status that's associated with it. You could not even become a naturalized citizen unless you could prove you were white.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
insane.
Well, I was going to say it's really interesting too, this whole history of race, because you mentioned your Italian ancestry, and my ancestry is Scottish and Irish, and at one point Irish people came to the U.S. as unskilled laborers,
Or
and
indentured servants.
Pardon me?
I said, or as indentured servants.
Yeah, which a lot of people try to claim, oh well, there were Irish slaves, but they weren't really slaves. You had an option at some point of paying off the debt and being free, and so it was nothing like what the Black community endured as enslaved people. But the interesting thing is that that's one of the tools that racists have used to divide people in this country. As soon as it became advantageous to co-opt the Irish or the Italians or anyone else into the racist community, the racists would just say, oh, well, you're not Black, so you're one of us, and so anybody not Black got co-opted, even though for most of these communities, their interests, would have been better served by aligning themselves with, former enslaved people and fighting against oligarchs and, the plantation owners and whatever.
Yeah,
but they wanted to cash in their whiteness,
Yeah, exactly. And it still works,
Yeah.
It still is effective. You've got people that are foaming at the mouth over critical race theory when that is not taught in any school, any secondary school. If you get to grad school, you could probably take a class on it depending on what university you attend, but it's not taught in any secondary school anywhere in this country. But you've got, entire school boards who are up in arms. They're going to ban something that's never going to be taught to their kids anyway. And unfortunately, they've expanded their definition of critical race theory to include actual U.S. history.
Yeah, they just did that down here in Florida. They did the Stop Woke Act.
Yeah.
And it was like, you can sue the schools, It's just disgusting.
Yeah, last week we had Professor Hodge on the show, and he made a statement at some point which really shocked me. But I think the more I think about it, the more I think he's right. He basically said the age of enlightenment is over. The misinformation campaign have won, and we're entering a new darker age. And I'm thinking, wow, when you see what's going on, especially in the United States, like, yeah, he's got a point there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Glenn Youngkin won the Virginia governor's race in part because he stoked, white suburban families' fears of critical race theory, particularly in Northern Virginia. So yeah, it's being used as a political weapon, and this has been going on forever.
Mm. I'm going into a different direction here, as much as because we don't often get female guests, and it's one thing I want to ask, because you find it as women that it's difficult sometimes to send a message through podcast, or is it much more difficult now to be able to broadcast your opinion out there as compared to maybe further in the past? What do you think is, how do I word this correctly? I'm not wording this right.
Do you think it's harder for us to be women in the community? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
People aren't going to listen just because we're.
You think your opinion and your podcast and the message you're trying to put out there is falling on deaf ears because you're women, or you think people are actually starting to pay attention to you?
Well, I can say that both in whatever media production I've ever done, or even in my professional life, it's often that I'll say something and it'll be dismissed, but then a male colleague will say the exact same thing, and suddenly that's brilliant. I've had my ideas stolen. People are more than happy to claim credit for good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's necessarily strictly a gender thing. I think that happens to a lot of men too, particularly if they're from a marginalized community, or sometimes just, younger,
Mm-hmm.
and people co-opt their ideas and pass them off as their own.
Mm-hmm.
But I have noticed that there's an awful lot of that going on, especially in social media. If I say something that is within my area of expertise, there's often some guy who will come in and challenge it. And when we poke around the edges a little bit, we find out that he has no expertise in that area at all.
Of course not.
But
sounds about right.
He feels entitled to question what I just said.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's scary.
Well, I've said it to Kevin. Him and I have been arguing with the same person online, and I come at him with pretty much the exact same points. I get blocked, and he keeps arguing with Kevin. That happens frequently.
Well, that happened with Amy and I online, where this dude just ignored everything Amy was saying and responded to me.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a prestige thing as well, right? And so I had a trans friend that reached out to me recently and said and is kind of just alerting me, but also a little bit frustrated because I have like a thread going on, and there's a guy that's on the thread, and my friend is reaching out to me and saying, do you notice that they will only really speak to you in a way that's respectful, and like everybody else, they just kind of tell us to chill out, even though you don't have any experience with these issues. And when you speak, they listen, they engage you. And it's strictly because they know who I am, right? But I also think that to a huge degree, people tend to gravitate and put their focus on other people who resonate with them. So if you have all the characteristics of the dominant culture, you're basically a beacon for the majority, right? And especially if you're putting out a majority message. So if you're saying stuff that's already being said, people hear that and it resonates because most of the folks are used to hearing it. So you're saying things that resonate with them because that's what they think, because that's what they've been told, because that's what the culture tells them. So you get somebody, and I don't want to name names, but like there was a guy that has like a media presence that got called out on an error that kind of made a little splash recently. And I'm just like, this person is the very example it's like exhibit A of how you can be a lower end, mediocre, cishet white male, and that's all it takes to get a following. Because you don't even have to be smart. You don't even have to be educated. You don't have to be, you just have to put out a message that the other people that are just like you hear and say, amen to that. That's exactly how I see the world. That's my exact experience. That's exactly what it's like. And if as a woman, if I were to get up and support that message, like to get up there and just kind of support that dominant male culture message, I would get so much male support, it would be ridiculous. I would have just men falling all over themselves to say how brilliant I am, because I'm telling them what they want to hear.
Yeah.
And the problem that back to the podcast, though, that's the thing. It's like those messages don't get heard. And so there's no challenge to the dominant message, right? There is no challenge because these people don't have a platform. So when you have one or two voices speaking up, when you've got like Ibrahim Kendi up speaking up, people that are the huge white dominant culture looks at that and they're just like, oh, who is this, this wild voice in the wilderness, saying these things that just don't make any sense. And they kind of poo-poo it and piss it away and act like it's ridiculous, and you don't have to listen to it. It reminds me a lot of like religion, like when I was in religion, and the way that you can just say like, oh, you just keep those messages out of the sphere, and then you can mock them and make fun of them and sort of strawman them however you want to, so that your little group doesn't have to hear them. And when you have the dominant culture, it's kind of the same thing. It's just a bigger mass, right? So when you've got the Christian culture saying something's ridiculous, and very few people that have a big platform that are pushing something like, evolution, then you hear the Christian message far more often. And when you have, white people talking about race, you're going to get your information about race from white people. And so when a black person tries to tell you what racism feels like or what racism looks like from where, their side of it, it doesn't make any sense to you. You're just like, well, that doesn't sound right. That's not, nobody I know has that experience. Right? None of my white friends, and my one black friend who I'm sure talks very honestly and frankly to me about race, because they know I would be very open-minded to hear anything about racism. That person tells me I'm not a racist. So you must, I don't know what's wrong with you, but that's how it works.
Yeah. You have a wrong point of view though, when you think nobody I know. Right? Like that's one of those things that you should that's when you should take pause. If you think that to yourself, it's time to take pause and look at what your worldview is.
Yeah. Well, and to Tracie's point here, one of the things that I've done over the years is, for whatever reason, my feed has been kind of curated to the point where I spend a lot of time, reading things from Black Twitter. And it's very enlightening. And especially if you, as a white person, if I just sit there and just read what people are saying, because they're telling, they're really talking to other members of the Black community and they're talking about their experiences and their frustrations and what they want and what their goals are. And if you sit there and you just listen and you don't try to challenge that, you just accept that their experiences are valid, it really opens your mind up to what other people experience. And then you can't really say, well, nobody I know experiences that, because you've listened to all these people. And it's really kind of funny because apparently the Facebook algorithm thinks I'm African American. And I'm fine with that, because it's serving me things that are more aligned with me politically than if they think I'm white.
Well, I had a funny story.
We're all African, right? So,
I had I had a guest on that's like a biracial musician. He's black and white, and he was talking to me, and I said something about having some how different groups have different things they deal with, and I was just like, when you are when you're trans and you're not out, no one knows you're trans. Now, it has its own challenge because you can't be authentic in your life, which is horrible. But at the same time, you're walking under a radar, and you have to sort of negotiate whether or not you want to be open about who you are with somebody. I'm like, but I'm like, you're biracial, but you look black. And so when you're walking around, people are seeing you and they know you know, you're black. So there's not this like coming out. Nobody comes out to their family as black, right? Like you pretty much are visibly black for the most part. I mean, obviously there's, you know, gradation and colorism and issues like that. But he kind of very nicely, I think, very nicely responded to basically say, you think black people are like being themselves to you? Like, seriously? Right? Like, as a white person, you think you're getting the real deal, that we're not being somebody else around you, like that we can just be ourselves in your space, really? And it really made me stop and think about my assumptions about being able to be authentic. You know, it's like, well, yeah, there is a certain amount of authenticity there that's available, but there's not like full authenticity, not like I usually can be.
Yeah, I mean, just even to have to think about that, you know, having to think about how much of myself am I going to be to this person, because I don't want to upset them. I don't want to, you know, I just want to kind of get along here, and I don't want to bring up whatever. You know what I mean? It's like
It must be
we
so.
don't have to think.
I live in Texas, so I can't like, you know, bring up my straight up atheism to coworkers. That would cause problems.
Right.
Just crazy to me.
It must be so tiring to always live with that mask on.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah, I think that's why you see the groups that have to have more of a mask have so much mental stress, you know, and self-harm metrics, like when you can't ever be yourself. And you just think about it, your whole family is telling you they love you, and you're thinking to yourself, do they really? Like, they don't even know me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
no.
you know, I served in the military for a long time, and about half of my career was before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and about half of, you know, the last half was after Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Mm-hmm.
And people think, well, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was an improvement, but it wasn't. It was far worse after Don't Ask, Don't Tell went into effect. Before that, the commander actually had some discretion about whether or not, you know, a gay person got discharged. If they were considered to be, you know, essential to the mission, then the commander could retain them. And there were
for a sec, Jen, maybe you'd be so kind of. We all know here, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but maybe part of our audience might not know, because our podcast is also in Canada. Maybe they might not know what exactly the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy is. Maybe you'd be so kind to briefly explain that.
Okay, yeah, sure. So there was a long-standing ban in the U.S. military on gay and lesbian or bisexual or any kind of not heterosexual, cisgender heterosexual person serving in the military. And so, and interestingly enough, it even the standards for entry in the military even specified that male applicants had to have 2 fully descended testicles. So that's how specific things were.
Wow.
So yeah, because
Jesus.
a friend of mine went to West Point and said that had had the one guy that had only one, and he was just born with one, and he had to get a waiver to get in. So
Wow.
so if you only had one nut, you had to get a waiver to get it in. So that's how, you know, specific things were. But anyway,
That's fascinating. Jeez.
That's a new logo.
Wow.
That's the military.
Mm-hmm.
you know, but so for the longest time, you know, it was you know, you couldn't serve if you were LGBTQ, except for some people that had waivers. Okay. And it was basically if you did not do anything to cause your command to take official notice of your sexual orientation, then they typically didn't pursue it. So what happened when Clinton took office is that one of the things that he had planned to do was abolish the ban on gay people serving. And there was such like right-wing backlash from that the compromise that he ended up putting in place was called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it basically codified what was the de facto policy in the military, at least in the Army, all along. But there were some added restrictions that basically bound service members to, you know, you could not disclose to anyone that you were gay. And so the only exceptions to that was if you had an attorney, that was covered by attorney-client privilege, or if you were seeking spiritual counseling. But of course, there were certain ministers. This was right about the time the evangelicals were starting to really infest the military. And so if you disclosed something to the wrong priest or minister, they'd probably find a way to out you anyway.
Of course.
So if you were depressed and you sought mental health treatment or something like that, whatever you disclosed to your psychiatrist, if they were in the military, that was not covered. They could disclose that information to your command because that had allegedly some bearing on your fitness for service. So anyway, things got grim after that. The discharge rate went way up, and it continued to go up each year until we got involved in Afghanistan. And suddenly the discharge rate for homosexuality plummeted. I'm quite sure that it wasn't because they ran out of gay people to discharge. It's that suddenly we need people to fight in this war, so exactly. We're not going to throw them away.
Throw them away until we need you.
Yeah. So anyway, so the bottom line is you had to remain silent about who you were. And the impact of this is that if, for example, if I had, if I'd been killed in combat or something like that, the Army would have appointed an officer to basically collect up all of my personal items and pack everything up to ship back to my family. And one of the things they're instructed to do is essentially to sanitize this stuff. So they would have removed anything that they considered to be, that would have diminished me in the eyes of my family. So if they had discovered, love letters from a girlfriend or anything like that, they would have disposed of those. So if
or porno mags.
Yeah, actually that was basically what we would do for because I had a soldier who was killed in a drunk driving incident. He wrapped himself around a pole in Germany. And so we had to go through his personal belongings, and we had found quite a collection of porn in his personal belongings. And so, yeah, that was the sort of thing that we would typically pull out. But they would also, if they had found any evidence that he was gay, they would have sanitized that from anything they sent back to his family. So it essentially ensured that, if you weren't out to your family, they would never know who you really were. And if you were, they would probably know there was a big chunk of your life missing, when they got this sanitized package of stuff home. Yeah. But the other thing is I've known people whose significant other was actually killed in the line of duty, and they were not recognized as that person's significant other. They could not escort the remains back home, were not provided leave to go to the funeral or even properly grieve for that. And so it was tragic on so many levels. And that's why we always talk about the closet's a place of death. Yeah. And I was just going to say one more thing. It literally is a place of death because in all of the history of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and its predecessor, no one serving in the military on active duty who was out was ever killed because they were gay. The only people who were killed because they were gay were closeted.
Interesting. Huh. Well, when ladies, when you think about what you've been through and the political status of what is happening in the United States and the fight for the social justice and all that, are you when you look at the future, are you positive about where society is heading, or do you fear for the worst?
I'm not very positive. And the big thing is that, think the thing that would change my mind is if we got voting rights legislation passed.
Mm-hmm.
If we could do that, if I could go into the next election confident that, you know, the Republicans are not going to be able to just throw out the results of an election and install their own, you know, slate of electors or candidates or whatever.
Oh, they're working on it.
Yeah, they're working really hard on it.
Yeah.
If we did that, then I'd feel very confident going forward.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Tracie?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I'm so disheartened about the status of our Supreme Court in the U.S. right now. It's just so heavily conservative leaning. They're, you know, like we all knew when they started packing the courts with conservative justices. We knew. I mean, they were basically promising outright that they were going to take down Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't say it during the hearings. It wouldn't have mattered if they did because they were going to get passed through anyway. So they could have said whatever they wanted, but I mean, we're seeing it now, and they're signaling pretty clearly that they're just waiting, chomping at the bit to get those cases before them, so that they can start eroding, you know, bodily rights for every pregnant person. I mean, they're targeting. Let's just be honest, like they're targeting women basically, but there's so much splash damage with other people that are going to be affected by this. Anybody that can be pregnant basically is at risk.
Can I interest you ladies to moving to Canada?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
You got friends up here, so come and see us.
Well, the thing that astonishes me about the hypocrisy of the Supreme Court is that, you know, they ruled that, you know, they let this Texas law stay in place that basically says that as soon as there's a heartbeat, you can't get an abortion. Well, most women don't even know they're pregnant by the time there is cardiac activity. It's not really even a fully formed heart yet. It's just cardiac activity. And so after that, you can't get an abortion. So you're forced to carry a pregnancy that you don't want. And that's somehow not an imposition, but it's an imposition for the government to mandate that you get a vaccine to stop a pandemic. You know?
Well, and they're not even mandating that you get a vaccine. They're just mandating that you either get the vaccine or you behave in a way that doesn't put everybody else at risk.
Exactly.
I mean, we're accommodating people. We have, there have been so much accommodations since COVID, right? Like you can get your curbside pickup groceries, you order. I mean, so it's not like we're saying, you know, you're not going to be allowed to live unless you go get vaccinated. You know, the mandates themselves are just about situations where you're going to put someone else at risk, and we're saying you can't do that, and they won't take it either way. So it's just like with our governor, he keeps posting. It's our governor and a couple other, all of our politicians really, Ted Cruz especially is, you know, going at it, but they keep posting and saying they don't want the vaccine mandates. They don't want you to have this vaccine to go to a public school. But at the same time, they don't want to have a mask mandate. They don't want to have, you know, and we have to open the schools, right? So you don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to get vaccinated, and we can't keep the schools closed. So it's like, wait, what is your plan to just put all our kids in a COVID
But
house?
it's crazy though, because schools have already had vaccine mandates. Like you have to show your vaccines.
We've
polio, MMR. I mean, the first vaccine mandate was done by George Washington. You can't get further back than that.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Well, and I always ask people, you know, when was the last time you heard of somebody, you know, in your area getting rabies from their dog? You know, you'd have to go back really far to find that. And it's like, oh, that's right. There's a mandate. You have to get rabies vaccines for your dog.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Oh, jeez.
Vaccines work. It's past her. Let's start with that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's pretty interesting. I mean, even this morning I was reading an article in the Globe and Mail, which is a big newspaper up here, that Canadian politicians are starting to really wonder about the situation in the States to the point that they're actually gearing up to possible civil war in the U.S. with all that's going on. And it's actually affecting our government at this point. So it's like, holy geez, man. Because being such close trading partners, if there was something as incredible as something like that happening in the States, it would definitely affect us economically speaking. So politicians are up here are starting to worry about what's going on in the States. That's kind of a scary thought when you think about it.
I mean, it's like Jen was saying though. If people could vote, it wouldn't even be a concern. The only thing that makes it a concern is the voting restrictions, which make this minority of people who have these bizarre extremist views capable of holding power. And even now, they're starting to go for like local elections because they know most people don't vote in a local election. So they're going to local city councils and they're going to the school board elections. And they're putting up candidates like these really candidates that are running on, hey, I will enforce your racism in the public school. Just put me in office, right? And it's this kind of they're not really half the country. Because most of our people aren't even voting. So this is like people who are voting, and it's a minority of the voters to the point they feel like they have to gerrymander and restrict the polling hours and make sure that, you know, we can't get people to the polls. They know they're a minority, but they don't care.
Yeah.
It also does make me really angry because something you pointed out is like a lot of people on the left don't seem to vote. And it's just like, we just need 10 minutes once a year, please. Just please go vote. Like, and my favorite line is, I'm not excited. And I'm like, I prefer not to be super excited by politicians. I prefer them to be slightly boring because it's like, I don't need my politician to be, I live in Minnesota, so we had Jesse Ventura. That was a very exciting politician. Let the police officers live wherever the heck they want. So all the officers who work in St. Paul and Minneapolis live in Maple Grove. None of them live where they work. None of them know the people that they're arresting or dealing with on a daily basis. And it's really bad for all of us here. So if somebody said, "Oh, it hurts," would you ever do anything if something happened to your house? Or like, would you call the police? Probably not. Because I don't expect them to do anything. I don't expect them to give a damn. I might do it because I have to do it for insurance. After that, it would be, yes, I called you, now go away and leave me alone. And definitely do not talk to my neighbors. I see you knocking on my neighbor's doors, I will come at you.
Tracie, Jen, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. Really, really appreciate you spending some time with us today. If people want to find out more about what you guys are up to, where can they find you?
This is Tracie, and like I said, I've got a podcast called At Home in My Head, and it's also a YouTube channel, so you should be able to Google that and find it. I don't think it would be that tough. And I just want to say thank you for inviting me on again. It's just been an absolute pleasure. Thanks everybody for for the conversation today.
No, not a problem.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. And I am a sometime guest on Tracie's podcast, as she said before, and I'm kind of minimizing my presence on Facebook because I think Facebook's kind of evil right now.
Can't blame you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter a lot, so you can look me up there.
Perfect. Ladies, before I let you go, I gotta have you say hi. This is Tracie and Jen, and we took a left at the valley.
Hi, this is Tracie
and Jen,
and we took a left
at the valley.
I love it.
That was awesome. Wow. Okay.
That was so good.
Wow. No planning or anything.
Yeah.
That was good.
That was awesome. And that was Tracie and Jen.
That was great.
What an interesting conversation that was.
Yes.
Yeah, that was fun.
I really admire the work that these ladies have done over the years. They obviously have a solid head screwed on as compared to me anyway.
I feel like that Jen's quite the activist for the LGBTQ community, which is amazing, and we need more people like her.
I think they're a great example for women everywhere. I think unfortunately, even in the atheist movement, I think there's a lack of women voices, and I really wish there were more. On this show, we've always had pretty strong women voices on the show. Even in the first version of LATV, there was three ladies. Now we have two. Forced men are outnumbering the women. Hey,
but, I can guarantee you that you get listened to more than we do.
You know what? No, if people listen to more than we did, then we listen to.
They're not smart to be listening to you.
I would agree,
but
it's not smart. It's not a smart thing to do.
And it's what
bad call.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward to. If you want to check out Tracie's show, at home in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting thing to go for. To see what's going on. Like she says, it's a bit like walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. So I really appreciate that, and I think this kind of activism is more needed.
I agree.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for listening, and thank you, Tracie and Jen, for being our guests, and thank you for listening, and thank you to my guests, my co-hosts, Benjamin, Bradley, Hertzie, and Sabrina. You can find us, follow us at leftatthevalley.ca. You can send us an email at leftatthevalley@outlook.com. You can find us on youtube.com/leftatthevalley.
Yep.
Perfect. I always forget that one.
Yeah. Facebook.com.
Facebook.com
/Left at the Valley.
At LATV Podcast on Twitter.
And on Instagram too somehow.
Yeah, somewhere on Instagram as well.
Yeah,
And you can also go to Patreon, become a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/LATV. Give us a 5-star review wherever you find us. It helps us and helps others find the show. Bradley, what do we got coming on there on Unapologetics?
Yeah, this Wednesday we'll be doing going at 11:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And yeah, just search Unapologetics, spell with an X, panel stream. And yeah, it's a great
YouTube.
time on YouTube. Yes.
But we also stream where else? We stream to Facebook. We stream to where else? Twitter.
And Twitter, yeah.
So yeah, we're all over the place on Wednesdays.
Perfect. Coming up next week we'll have Bernard Lamborel, old guest, will come back for his new book.
In English, it's Bernard Lamborel.
All right. We'll have Brenda Fraser. He's the head of the Canadian Atheists.
I'm excited about that.
We'll have John the Godless Engineer. It's been a while.
Yeah.
John, so he'll be fun. He'll be talking to us as well. We'll have Janice Selby will be coming back. We'll probably talk about Court 2022 as well.
Yeah.
And what else we got? We got Ian Harris will be coming as well. Funny guy. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
Thank Bradley for that one. And we're also talking to Andrew Seidel
at
some point. And we'll also have somebody from Recovering from Religion as well coming down the pipe because they're doing a fundraiser. So maybe we'll see them on Unapologetics. Anyway, we're working that out. Perfect.
Cool.
Anything missing here?
Have a great week as always.
Perfect. All right, guys. Until next time.